On June 15, 1974, two highly motivated explorers, Martin Farr and Roger Solari, were exploring the most extensive cave systems in UK, hoping to extend the known passages. Despite being in their early 20s, both Martin and Roger were quite experienced for their ages. They had been involved in dry caving for nearly a decade, but had progressed to cave diving in the past 3 years. But what happened to those explorers during the Agen Allwedd Cave exploration that day? Stick around till the end to know the whole story. The first attempt. The year 1994 was the first time when Martin Farr and Roger Solari teamed up to expand the mapping of the Agen Allwedd Cave system in South Wales. A prominent explorer, John Parker, had recently ceased his exploration after discovering a third sump in one of the longest passages. A sump is a water-filled tunnel in a dry cave that dips in elevation. Short sumps can be swum through by holding one's breath, but longer ones require full scuba diving gear. The complexities and dangers of dry caving are much higher when cave diving is involved. Martin and Roger plan to go beyond the two previously discovered sumps to explore the third sump. However, on their planned trip in May, Martin had to go solo because Roger had injured his knee. Despite the risks, Martin was determined to navigate through the third sump to see what lay beyond. Reaching the third sump was a significant achievement in itself. He was energized by the excitement of what might be beyond Sump 3. By the time he reached the first sump, he had already traveled over 4,000 feet of tough stoops, low crawls, and tight squeezes in the Southern Stream Passage. Moving through the first two sumps, which were 250 feet and 85 feet long, respectively, was relatively easy for Martin. Despite the challenge of swimming through tight underwater tunnels and emerging in small open pools, he was undeterred. The third sump was much longer, and no one had fully traversed it yet. Martin hoped to have enough air to reach the end, but had no idea what lay beyond. He swam through the length of Sump 3, covering 850 feet before reaching the next air chamber. Martin knew he couldn't enter the water on this visit as his air tank back at Sump 3 would only suffice for 3 dives needed to exit the tunnel. He was a mile away from the exit and would spend the next 4 or 5 hours making his way back out. Once he found his way out, he contacted Roger to plan their next visit. They would need to bring an extra air tank to explore the 4th sump in the cave system. Roger shared Martin's excitement about what might be on the other side. The second visit. This time, the duo's plan was to trek more than a mile and dive through 4 narrow water tunnels to reach an unknown cave or air pocket on the other side. On June 15, 1974, Roger and Martin made their way through the path Martin had visited just weeks before. Before entering Sump 3, they had switched to fresh air cylinders, leaving the particularly used tanks on the back for their return trip. They had carried 3 tanks each into the cave and would start the Sump 3 dive with 2 full tanks each. Both men were excited as they exited Sump 3. The new pathway was a first for Roger, and the energy of exploration filled them during the 1,800-foot trek. They moved slowly and carefully to avoid damaging their essential diving equipment. As they approached the sump pool and set down their equipment, a sudden feeling of dread overcame them. The electric mood from a few minutes ago had turned into a somber silence. They were still eager to proceed with the dive, but the change in the atmosphere was palpable. The walls seemed to have closed in, and the air felt thick and suffocating. They had each a full tank for the Sump 4 dive, along with the remainder of the tank in Sump 3. But this didn't bring them much comfort. One broken valve or damaged tube could leave them trapped in the cave. Despite this ominous feeling, the men gathered their equipment and submerged. Roger carried 400 feet of line to lay, while Martin brought another spool with 1,000 feet of line. They moved together as a team, though each was responsible for their own safety and deciding when to turn back. Roger's tanks were slightly smaller than Martin's, so they knew he would likely turn back before Martin. They also had different buoyancies, with Roger floating toward the top and Martin sinking toward the bottom. They moved through the newly discovered sump slowly, twisting their bodies to fit through the narrowest sections, going deeper and deeper as they laid the line. Roger's reel ran out of the line at 400 feet. At this point, Martin tied his line and noticed that Roger was suffering from sinus issues again. Roger had experienced this many times before, but was determined to continue. Martin, however, broke the cardinal rule of diving, the rule of thirds. This rule dictates that you should use 1/3 of your air for the dive out, 1/3 for the return, and keep 1/3 in reserve for emergencies. Martin had already used his first third of air and should have turned back when Roger's line ran out. Assuming Roger had reached his third of air and was heading back, Martin's curiosity got the better of him. He continued until he came out to a gravel wall of rock, hoping it indicated an air pocket above. He planned to follow the wall up and catch his breath in the air pocket before turning back. However, as he ascended the wall, he found only a rock ceiling above. Realizing he needed to turn back, he followed the path to the right, hoping for air just beyond the rock outcropping. After another 30 feet, he reached a dead end with no air pocket. Turning back, he saw Roger near the top of the passage looking shocked. Martin signaled they must head out immediately. Roger's anguished expression likely stemmed from the realization that he might not have enough air to make it back. Martin quickly moved down to the bottom of the passage and followed the line out. He had only gone about 130 feet when his tank ran out of air. Calmly, he switched to his reserve tank, but knew he would barely have enough air to make the next 300 feet in this sump and the 850 feet in sump 3. He had a partial tank between sumps 2 and 3, if he could make it that far. Martin surfaced in the sump 4 pool and checked his gauge, realizing he had just enough air for the next dive. While waiting for Roger to get to the surface, Martin sat on the bank to claim his nerves. He knew Roger had less air. After an hour, Martin knew Roger must have run out of air. He stepped into the water and pulled the guideline, which was no longer connected. Martin reeled in the line until he found out it had been cut cleanly at the 430-foot mark, likely where Roger had switched tanks. Back then, switching tanks wasn't simple. The equipment was poorly designed, and finding the valve might require removing tanks and twisting the body. These circumstances likely led to Roger getting tangled and cutting the guideline. Martin had to stay calm to safely exit through the 3 remaining dives and the long hike out. It would be hours before he could alert anyone to Roger's fate and organize a search team. The devastating reality was if they had followed the rule of thirds, Roger would still be alive. If Roger had gotten tangled or gone the wrong way with half a tank of air, he could have reorientated himself and made it out safely. If Martin had kept a reserve, he could have turned back to look for Roger. After this dive, Martin Farr never broke the rule of thirds again and went on to have a notable diving career over the next several decades. What happened to Rogers? Weeks and years passed after the accident. All attempts to find Roger were unsuccessful. He was nowhere to be found in Sump 4. Martin conducted a thorough search of the sump in 1981, covering nearly 700 feet from top to bottom, but found no trace of Roger. The area remained incredibly difficult to explore, with all equipment and air needing to be carried over a mile deep into the tunnels. It took years for another team to explore the sump again, knowing Roger's body was somewhere in the tunnel. New cavers aimed to continue the exploration beyond Sump 4. In the fall of 1986, Ian Rowland and Julian Walker managed to push past Martin's limit, reaching 720 feet into the sump. There, they found Roger's body, 12 years after he went missing. Due to the sump's challenging conditions, removing Roger's body was deemed nearly impossible and too risky, so it was decided to leave his body in place. The entrance to this cave system is now locked, and the key is only available to experienced cavers with approved permission. A plaque was placed near the entrance to Sump 1 in honor of Roger Solari's life. This brings us to the end of a tragic cave exploration, where excitement and adventure was at its peak, but short-lived at the same time. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more interesting videos.